These are a set of questions asked me by a young Chinese anthropologist about my relationship and thoughts of my former PhD supervisor, Christoph von Haimendorf. So I will just answer them briefly after reading out the question. Throughout your academic career, your study experiences are very rich. So what do you think about interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary research? Well, obviously I think it's a very good thing. I myself was trained as a historian, and then I retrained as an anthropologist, and then went back as a historian and retrained, and then got a job as an anthropologist. But it's not just these two disciplines. I've also dabbled in political philosophy, in demography, medical history, all sorts of different art history and so on. Basically, you have a problem and you follow it wherever it leads, and it's almost bound to lead beyond the borders of a discipline. On the other hand, it's quite difficult to do, tricky, and you have to work with colleagues to make sure that you're not making stupid mistakes in someone else's discipline. So it's absolutely essential in this interconnected world that we are multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. So I'm in favour of it. You had obtained a DPhil degree. Why did you pursue another doctorate in anthropology? Well, as I was doing my DPhil in the history of witchcraft in England, I began to read anthropology and realised that while history gives you very rich information about the past, it doesn't suggest the questions you should ask. And so I found in anthropology a wide set of exciting questions which I would like to ask, which hadn't been asked, many of them, before, because historians were limited by their sources. And of course there are some questions you can ask and you can never get sources to answer them, so the trick is to ask new and interesting questions, but at the same time to realise that there's no point in asking them if there's no evidence. So I switched to anthropology, also because I'd been born and brought up for a few years in Assam in India, and I'd always wanted to go back there, and anthropology I was beginning to realise might be a way of giving me an excuse and a reason to go back to the eastern Himalayas. Why did you choose Professor Haimendorf as your anthropological mentor? Well, I didn't choose him really. He was chosen for me. I was at the London School of Economics and expressed an interest in doing a PhD. There was no one particularly at the London School, but people knew that Professor Haimendorf was the great expert on the Himalayas, which is where I wanted to go. So I was sent to see him and transferred my registration from the LSE to the School of Oriental and African Studies, where he was head of the Department of Anthropology. So he was chosen for me. What difficulties did you encounter when Professor Haimendorf suggested that you move your research from northeastern India to Nepal? And how did Haimendorf and his wife Betty help you? Well, I'd originally intended to do my research on one of the matrilineal societies in Assam, the Khasis or the Garos, who were very close to where I was born in Shillong. But when I came to discuss it with Haimendorf and others, it became clear that I would never get research permission to go there because there was a war going on. There was a Naga resistance movement fully fighting against the Indian government in that area, and despite Haimendorf's connections, I couldn't go there. So he suggested Nepal. I didn't even know where Nepal was, so he had to show me on the map in his study where I might be going. But he said it was very exciting, very rich, hardly researched, very beautiful, and he knew of some good things and places I should work on. So it wasn't really a big shock, though somewhat of a disappointment. In the 1990s, when you and Sarah Harrison helped to organise the materials at Professor Haimendorf's house, did anything happen that impressed you? What was the status of Professor Haimendorf at that time? Well, I kept in touch with Christoph, as I called him. I interviewed him, and from that interview, done in 1982, I realised that he had all this wonderful material in his home. He talked about it and said that he didn't really know what he was going to do with it, although actually it turned out there was a plan. And so he invited us to come and have a look at it, and Sarah and I went down and found this cupboard full of films, hundreds of reels of 16mm films, and his wife Betty said, "Oh, you know, this is just clogging up our house, so we're probably going to throw it away. Do you want it?" So we took several expeditions in our old car and brought it back to Cambridge. We also found in his study a number of filing cabinets filled with slides and also boxes of prints, and we began to realize what an amazing photographer he was. I mean, it was clear from the few photographs in his books that he was pretty good, but this was such an extensive collection. So that, on top of some field diaries, early field diaries of his trip to Nepal and elsewhere, which we borrowed and photocopied, it was clear increasingly to me, and I'd studied quite a lot of anthropologists by that time, that he was the most wide-ranging ethnographer of the Himalayas and central India in the history of anthropology. He'd worked in more societies and done it in a depth of documentation through not just his very, very detailed notebooks on the Nagas and elsewhere, but also in these films and photographs and some tape recordings. So it was very exciting. Towards the end, he began to lose his memory somewhat, and it became quite difficult to get him to partake in the organisation. And a young friend of mine, Hamish, tried to get him to organise his photographs, but he would disarrange them between each visit. So finally they went to the School of Oriental and African Studies, and later we took the films there too, after we had copied them. Please talk about the overall impact and help of Haimendorf on you. Well, Christoph was a wonderful help. He was, there are various kinds of supervisor. My first supervisor, Sir Keith Thomas, who supervised my history DPhil, was absolutely wonderful in the sense of paying keen attention to everything I wrote, suggesting new sources, suggesting ideas, discussing, meticulous. I was his first student and he was a great historian, is a great historian. And so I had that kind of supervision. Christoph's wasn't like that. He read what I wrote but hardly made any comments, because he was now quite aged. He was on the edge of retirement when I met him, so in his mid-60s and relaxing after a very busy, energetic life. He was still going out to India every year and still interested in anthropology, but he wasn't particularly interested in the latest fads and fashions of anthropology. But where he was wonderful was A, that he knew the whole area very well. He travelled over it, so he could direct me where to go. Secondly, he knew what needed doing, so he suggested I went to an area which turned out to be very fruitful, the Gurums. Thirdly, he knew everyone in senior positions and middling positions in anthropology of the Himalayas, so he could provide me with excellent contacts, not only in Europe, but when I went to Nepal, he put me in touch with the Thyssen Centre so I could relax in Kathmandu on the holiday there, and so on. So he was a great facilitator, a sort of umbrella to aid my research, and I couldn't have had anyone better. Finally, his interest in film and photography and tape recordings meant that he encouraged me to do that, to take out a good camera, to take a tape recorder and to make use of it, and later to film. And so my interest in that kind of recording, I think, was greatly stimulated by him. What role did Professor Haimendorf play in your focus on academic research in Asia? Please talk specifically. Well, I have really talked about that. He guided me to go to Nepal and also was interested in my work elsewhere in Asia. Later, when I began to realize how rich his collections were, it was, we decided in 83, after the interview, to start on a project on the Nagas of Assam, which was his first extended field work. So I shifted somewhat from Nepal, though I continued to work there, to the border of Burma, and to make a video disc and an exhibition and a book and a database about the Nagas, principally based on his wonderful photographic collection and his extraordinary diaries written in Austrian and German, which we had translated and put onto the university website. So he helped me ease towards Assam as well, and he'd had a young friend who had worked in the area I wanted to work in, the Garo Khasi area, Chi Nakane, or Nakane Chi, who turned out later to be the greatest, perhaps, 20th century anthropologist of Japan, who I met later, and the contact with Haimendorf helped me in my relations with her and my later work in Japan. In the specific academic research, besides drawing your attention to the role of pictures, sounds and images in anthropological research, what other aspects of influence does Professor Haimendorf have on you? Well, I think I've mainly answered that, but I think what I learned, other things I learned from him, was his enthusiasm, his great curiosity to learn about other cultures, and his courtesy with dealing with people, and his roving spirit. He was an anthropologist who had worked first in the Nagas, with the Nagas, and then during the war in Arunachal Pradesh on the borders of Tibet and China, and also in Hyderabad, on 3 or 4 different groups in Hyderabad, not just one. And then when he went to Nepal, he worked among the Sherpas, but also with other groups, the Nawars, travelling through the Gurungs and so on. So he worked in perhaps a dozen different societies, and as soon as he'd really understood the basics of a society, he would move on. So this idea of not just spending your whole life in one, even civilization, let alone one society, I found very valuable and has helped me to develop a style of anthropology where I travel widely and do what Haimendorf did, which is to talk to people in depth from the society, to make friendships, deep friendships in the society, and to do a different kind of anthropology, not the extended year, 2 years in one place anthropology, which I did for my first fieldwork, but for a month travelling through remote areas or cities and towns, and just getting the first strong impression of a place so that you could compare it with other places. What theoretical inspiration did you get from Professor Haimendorf? Well, Haimendorf was mainly an ethnographer, a collector of information, and although, of course, there is no real distinction between ethnography and anthropology, you have to have theories if you're going to collect material. He was mainly concerned with documentation. But his books, even the early ones, the Naked Nagas, Konyak Nagas, and his books on the Indian tribes and Sherpas, have theories, have ideas, have analytical underpinning, of course. I think one or two of his ideas particularly interested me. He wrote a book which is his most theoretical, perhaps, called Morals and Merit, which was considering the ethical systems of the different societies he'd been to. And that contains ideas about the relationship between morality and society, which I found stimulating. And he wrote an article which I also really liked, called The Afterlife in Indian Tribal Societies, or something like that. And he put forward a very interesting Durkheimian theory that in tribal non-literate oral societies he'd been in those areas, the afterworld is not, as in the monotheistic and actual religions of the world, it's not a vague kind of world which has little relation to this one. But in these afterworlds, the afterlife, as I found it among the people I worked with, is a direct mirror of this world, but without the pain and the suffering. So my Gurung experience was an instance of this. You travel up to the afterworld, and there you have oxen, and you have ploughing, and you have houses like the ones you know, and you meet your old friends and so on. So it's this world on another level, but without the pain and the suffering. So you go to spirit village, Pla Nasa, and there you find the spirits of other people who seem to have bodies. Now, this is a vision you find in many of the tribal societies, and I find it a much more exciting and interesting idea than my own Christian idea of wafting around in a cloud and listening to people strumming harps, etc., or even nirvana and extinction. If you're going to have an afterworld, then it should, I think, be like that. Are the Naga Video Disc project and the Himalayan Digital project that you advocate directly related to Professor Haimendorf? Yes, absolutely. The Naga Video Disc project arose directly out of the fact that he had such rich collections of photographs and diaries and some later films on the Nagas. And then he put me in touch, which is again another thing I gained from him, from other friends, from J.P. Mills's widow, to Mildred Archer, to Ursula Graham Bauer, all of who were friends of his and who I did some interviews with, and I copied many of their materials, and they probably wouldn't have helped me in the same way if I hadn't known Christoph and been recommended by him. So he helped me a great deal in that way and directed me towards the Nagas, and he was always very generous with his material. He never asked for money, he didn't ask about contracts or copyright agreements, he just made it available. And so the Naga Video Disc project was in many ways his project as well. And this led on later to the Himalayan Digital project. One of the people who worked with us on his films, particularly indexing and analysing his films and some of his other materials, was Mark Turin, now Professor Mark Turin of the University of British Columbia. Mark worked with Christoph's materials extensively, and he, that is Mark himself, had done his fieldwork in the Himalayas in another society to the east of Kathmandu, and so he was very interested in that whole area. So he and his wife Sarah Schneiderman worked with us for a year or two on a project to document the Himalayas, and this was around 2000 to 2002 when the internet was just emerging, And Mark came up with the idea of making a database, or rather website, of my materials, alanmacfarlane.com, and helped to design that, which later, for many years, Sarah has been the web business of. And Mark came up with the idea of making a website around the Himalayas, and he came up with the good title of digitalhimalaya.com. And that is now a very important repository, not only of original materials but also of secondary materials, many journals and maps and other things like that. So it directly flowed out of Christoph's interest in the whole Himalayan region. How did Professor Haimendorf evaluate the Naga video disc project? Well, he came to the opening, I think, of the project when we opened it in the museum with the Minister of Nagaland, and he was clearly delighted. We gave him a copy of the book, and we encouraged him to write his autobiography, which he did a little late in his life, so some of the memories and energy had gone. But it's an interesting autobiography, and well worth while as a connector between his various field works. But he clearly loved working with us. It's always a pleasure when you retire, as I know now, to work with younger colleagues who are interested in your work. He did this with other people, with my friend Piers Videbski, Michael York and others, on projects which he directed and then participated in. But he was clearly very happy to see us when we went down to his lovely house in West London and spent time with Betty and himself, and those were very happy, pleasant occasions. What do you think about the development tendency of Chinese anthropology in the future? Well, the potentials are huge. China has, of the traditional kind of anthropological work, that is on ethnic minorities and more rural communities, China has the largest collection of such peoples in the world, nearly 100 million minority peoples in China, including Tibet and so on, which is bigger than anywhere else in the world. And also because of the nature of Chinese history, many of them until recently were fairly undisturbed. They went through the Cultural Revolution, but after that things were restored. So you have a vast wealth of amazing materials rapidly disappearing. There's only a generation or two before the roads, which have already been built to most of them, the schools, the medical centres and so on, will suck away much of their traditional culture. So in terms of documentation of those areas, there's a vast amount to be done, and something is being done, I'm glad to say, already. But of course anthropology is not just about such places. The cities, the extraordinary development of China, the most amazing transformation that I've ever encountered as a historian, in the big cities like Shenzhen and Shanghai and so on, Chengdu, that also is very worthwhile anthropology. So the kinds of anthropology stroke sociology that can be done is very important and interesting. As yet, during the Cultural Revolution, anthropology was frowned on, and the leaders of anthropology, Fei Xiaotong and so on, were sent out of their jobs. I think anthropology now has a huge presence. I gather that there are more anthropologists, in inverted commas, in China than there are anywhere else in the world. But they're very dispersed and diffused. They tend not to be in departments. There are one or two departments in Fujian and in Beijing and so on, but in the one I work in Sichuan, for example, there are probably half a dozen to a dozen anthropologists, but they're scattered through history departments and Tibetan studies departments and so on and so on, so they don't really have an identity. And secondly, the training of anthropology as yet in China is way behind what it is in Western universities. There are some very good teachers and very good students, but formal training is only really beginning. So a great deal has to be done to strengthen the institutional structure of anthropology in China, but it is happening. What are your opinions on Himalayan studies in China? Give us your personal views on the strengths, weaknesses, future trends, meanings, and your suggestions of Himalayan studies in China. Well, I've talked about that a little bit. There are huge potentials. The main area, of course, in terms of Himalayan studies are in Sichuan, Yunnan, Guizhou, and a little bit Guangxi, and of course Tibet and that area. It's difficult to be more precise. I mean, there are people working in all those areas, and there are some important centres. There's a couple in Kunming, there are a couple in Sichuan, centres for study of the Himalayas, and there is funding coming in for those, and the government is very interested in them because it's an important area of minorities, and it's important the relations with the minority peoples are as good as possible. So there's funding, and there are film developments in, particularly in Kunming. So I think there are great potentials. What would be excellent is to have a coordination. One of the things I've noticed about Chinese academic life is that it's pretty fragmented. Not merely that anthropologists are dispersed between universities, but even within universities there's a lot of rivalry and suspicion between departments, competition for resources, and the whole of Chinese academic life is just shaping itself up. So basically there needs to be more collaboration and new centres and developments occurring, but I think it will happen, and when it does, China will become one of the forefronts of anthropology in the world. It is already leapfrogging ahead in the sciences and technologies, and even in some of the arts and humanities, and there's no reason why it shouldn't do the same in the social sciences. What do you think the Himalayan study of Haimendorf has implications for the Chinese Himalayan research? Well, the thing that anthropology needs, among other things, is time depth. And China, the Chinese studies of the Himalayas, there are fragmentary visits and bits of ethnography dating back to probably the early 20th century in different parts of China. But there isn't much systematic, as far as I know, systematic study of the Himalayan regions. And that not only applies to the Chinese side of it, but China is interested in the other side of the borders, in Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, Assam, Burma. And therefore it really needs, within Chinese organizations in terms of libraries and databases, it needs materials from the West about those areas, because it was really the West that obviously conquered or colonialized or sent the anthropologists to these areas. So the early documentation, for example, of Nepal is done by Westerners, not Chinese. And so it would be very valuable for China to have copies of all the classic texts. I mean, they're not so many. I mean, you could get all the really important works on the Himalayas by anthropologists into quite a small room. But they need to be there in China, in several centres. But they also need to be translated, because obviously many younger Chinese can speak and read some English, but they also need the texts in their own language. And so a large translation effort. And the work of Haimendorf, which, if you extend it beyond just the Himalayas, if you go down to his work on Central India as well, as part of his corpus, greater ethnographies, it's a good shelf full of detailed ethnographies. And the other thing that you would learn by doing that work of translation, that work, is his method. You need actually not just the finished monographs, you need to know about how he collected his material. But that is now possible because we have done this one in-depth study which is available on the internet, and a lot of it is being transferred to Sichuan University. And that shows you how he collected his field notes, his very important diaries, his censuses, his photographs, and so on. Because, and this is another example, if I may push my own work, I've just recently written the 8th part of my autobiography, and it isn't quite yet, it is just published. It's called Nepal, Becoming an Anthropologist, and it's the only detailed account, I think, in any language, of how an anthropologist actually collects their material and what the experience of anthropology really is. Because what I do is I take all my letters, I wrote very frequently to my mother in particular, all the letters home, letters from home, letters by my wife Jill, and then examples of the censuses and surveys and field notes and diaries and the photographs and links to the films which we took on our first field work. So it's a year in the Himalayas through the actual records. So it shows the stresses, strains, rewards, happiness, sadness of fieldwork in a way which no other book does. So that's another guide. And finally, Sichuan University itself is publishing several of my books and guides to Nepal, I think with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences or some such, and those will be out in Chinese quite soon. So it's an opening time with huge possibilities, and I wish all my young Chinese friends and others who watch this all success. Their work is absolutely essential. Imagine someone in 300 years' time, they look back and they said, well, what did you do to document what was happening in China during the last great period of the Chinese boom and the ethnic minority richness of culture? And if we don't do much, they will be very disappointed. Thank you.